Okay, so we're going to start by me moving backwards through the lesson. Apologies there. With the origins of the progressive movement. I say this all the time, but this is relatively a short lesson, and I promise you that. Now, where did the progressive movement come from? And there are really five reasons we're going to examine here. But first, before I get into that, let's talk about who the progressives were. It's really important to know that unlike the populists, the progressives are not a political party. In fact, there will be a political party in 1912, but overall, all of the progressive presidents, if you will, do not run or do not represent a political party known as the progressives. And in fact, there is none for the majority of the progressive era, which broadly speaking goes from 1919 to the end of the First World War, 1918, 1919. So, or 1900 to 1919. Um, so, who are the progressives? A collection of groups who influenced change in the first part of the 20th century. They react to a number of things. Number one, the social effect of industrialization on ordinary people, and very acutely how the nation was governed. Theodore Roosevelt, who becomes president in the early part of the 20th century, is often considered the first progressive. And in the 1904 presidential campaign, he'll talk very clearly about what he calls a square deal. Prompted by a miners' strike, in fact, he said citizens should have a square deal. And in that sort of square deal, he's the first president to champion, let's just say, the regulation of business on a major scale. The square deal for most people becomes shorthand. The term shorthand refers to a word or a term that references something. So it becomes shorthand for progressive politics, people looking for a square deal. And they argue that the federal government should change the nature of the way it involves itself in American life, that it should have an activist role instead of playing a very hands off, laissez faire role. The 1890s, then, are, as we've seen, an era of transition. We talked a lot about in the last unit when we looked at the Gilded Age the fact that by the late part of the 1890s, a whole bunch of populist movements are emerging in agriculture and elsewhere, demanding change based on the sort of the excesses of the Gilded Age. So therefore, the 1890s, though so technically part of the Gilded Age, is that period of transition into the progressive era. So why did progressivism emerge as a major political force in the 1890s? The first reason we have to cover is the idea of populism. The historian H.W. Brand says the progressive movement was to some extent a housebroken version of populism. In other words, where populism was quite revolutionary by American standards, progressive movement is, although it adopts a lot of the ideas of populism, is not necessarily quite as radical. Okay, we know that the populists emerge in the 1870s and 1880s. Some examples of populist movements include the Grangers, the Greenbackers, and of course the Populist Party itself, representing a whole bunch of areas of society, but in large part springing out of the complaints of small farmers from the West and the South who had suffered disastrously in the economic panics of 1873, 1893, et cetera, et cetera. Um, the People's Party is an example of a populist movement, and it forms and it won some pretty big elections. For instance, they win the governorship of Nebraska in 1892. The first real progressive politician was the Democratic Party candidate of 1896, William Jennings Bryan, who, as you recall, lost quite spectacularly in the 1896 election, but nevertheless championed a very much progressive cause. Of course, he talked about things like bimetallism, the idea of shifting away from the gold standard to a limited production of silver coinage. Doesn't happen, it's probably bad economic sense, but nevertheless, you start to see that it becomes mainstream in the political process. At the turn of the century, and by the turn of the century, the urban middle class will begin to adopt a lot of progressive policies. That is, except bimetallism. Many of their policies, again, would then be adopted by Theodore Roosevelt. I think I had mentioned in previous lessons that people started to look, especially those involved in politics at the turn of the 20th century, and started to see that the wave of populism was spreading, and either they were going to be crushed by it or they needed to get along with it. And Theodore Roosevelt becomes, perhaps unexpectedly, because he's a Republican, a champion of many progressive policies. And some people call him the first progressive president, and it's probably fair to say that. And we'll talk about Roosevelt in great detail, including a more comprehensive look at the square deal and other lessons. But you just have to understand that the political movements that are generated in the later half of the Gilded Age really are the foundations of the progressive movement. The second thing we have to look for is the idea of government and laissez-faire. The way that government's action, or more correctly, inaction in most cases, affected people's lives. In the modern age, with technology and business becoming ever more complex, there was a general belief among most Americans that sort of laissez-faire government, federal government role that was envisaged in the Constitution was out of step with the new modern era, and that they were looking for, in many ways, a reform of the way the federal government acted, which would include, of course, a reform of the Constitution. Um, you have progressive theorists, people in universities and so forth, writing books suggesting that laissez faire could not continue. And they also start to complain that, of course, the system is, quote, tilted against the people who had to live within it, and that those who ran for government office were not reflecting the will of the people. They started to look at the way people became politicians, the way they got put forward for elections, and they saw that this sort of created a endemic corruption in which the only a small group of people representing a small narrow interest, of course that of the big business and the upper class, um, and ever ending up in politics. And therefore, if that be the case, then change was almost impossible to come. They wanted to make the United States a heck of a lot more democratic. They wanted to give people a say in all aspects of the political process, not only in, as they always had, of course, the election of their president, but also in the election of the candidates who got an opportunity to run for president. And government action and inaction becomes a target of the progressive era. The third reason is muckraking. We've talked a lot over past lessons about journalists who go and expose the horrors and abuses, and I'm not going to get into any great detail. I've talked about Jacob Riis, I've talked about Henry Damaris Lloyd, I've talked about Lincoln Steffens and his articles entitled "The Shames of the Cities Before." Ida Tarbell, of course, whose sort of expose of Standard Oil became one of the most well-read muckraking books. I've talked a lot about those. I'm not going to tell you about them once again, but all I'm going to say is this. Muckraking journalism in an era when, especially amongst the middle class, they were becoming more and more literate, becomes a prominent force in pushing people into or having people take an interest in progressive politics. Interestingly enough, most historians conclude that muckraking journalists will claim way more influence than they actually had. They do play an important role in forcing the agenda of politicians, or providing, let's just say, the moral and factual support that politicians will need to argue their cause or argue for more progressive policies in America. Now, that point at the bottom is sort of a token evaluative point, something you can think of if you're ever asked to assess the significance of factors for the emergence of progressivism, and you have to start talking about muckraking. So do make note of that. The fourth reason is industrial abuses, big business, and monopolies. Okay, we've covered this in great detail in the Gilded Age. Corporations form monopolies. Trusts ensure those monopolies can cross state lines. They ensure, along with excesses of immigration, that the average pay, benefits, if there was any, of the working man was very, very, very low. There is no safety net at all for the working man. Working conditions are terrible in most factories. Most people worked a 6-day, 72-hour work week. The average take-home pay, I believe, around the turn of the century was somewhere less than $5 a week. People were poor. And the fact that there was this unlimited supply of cheap labor very much meant that the industrial working class could always seek to keep people down. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a very few, and the political corruption that came with it, led to a widening of social divisions. The fact that the rich and the poor were getting further and further away from each other. And of course, we saw that this manifests itself in industrial strife. We've talked a lot about the Gilded Age and the fact that strikes start to increase, though they don't accomplish much, because oftentimes, especially the big ones anyway, are broken by government and or companies like the Pinkertons hired by big business as strikebreakers, many people do feel, and it's a manifestation of the fact that many people feel that the interests of the masses are being subordinated for the profits of a few. And these people start to demand government regulation for industrial abuses. And because there are a lot of them, they have a lot of political impact and sway. The last reason, again, something we've talked about already, is the growth and fear of socialism. We know that socialist parties start to emerge around the turn of the century. For instance, a Socialist Party of America, led by Eugene Debs, is formed in I think it's 1904. By 1912, it has elected 15 socialist mayors in American politics, and they get 6% of the vote in a national election. Now, amongst frightening the upper class, and that's very obvious, who would be fearful of socialist revolution, it started to frighten the middle class, who feared basically a socialist takeover would sort of ruin their hard-won gains. As a result of this, and somewhat interestingly enough, the desire for reform in many ways gets taken up by the socialists, not out of a pure moral belief in a lot of cases, or sorry, by the socialists, by the middle class. Not out of this like great moral belief that the progressive cause was the right one and that we had to work for the workers. They wanted to because it meant that if we get progressive policies, we could get meaningful reform. And if we get meaningful reform, we will avoid communist revolution. And for the middle class, reform for the working class is preferable to allowing things to get out of hand and a communist revolution. Now, how ambitious were these aims? It's an interesting question. Taken from the perspective of today, we can say that, well, the Gilded Age was so laissez-faire, the abuses were so great, the government was so keen to act on the interests of big business. Therefore, it seems, taken from our 21st century viewpoint, many, many years later, that the progressives were incredibly ambitious. They wanted to change everything, it seems. Okay? We tend to also view the US federal government as an immovable force. We overemphasize perhaps the weakness of the poor immigrants and the working class. We think that, well, the progressives can't be successful because the populist the party, for instance, failed so spectacularly. William Jennings Bryan got crushed in 1896. The Grangers and the Greenbackers have almost no effect whatsoever. And we tend to see that, well, they probably don't stand a chance. However, the progressives at that time didn't see it that way. Okay, they started to feel, and they really much felt, they got sort of the zeitgeist of the time was that American society had very real structural problems that must be solved. And as a result, they thought that it was inevitable that in a very short period of time, the proposals of the progressives should become law in the early part of the 20th century. And in many cases, they're right. It can be argued then that the proposals of 1890 were not necessarily that ambitious, as we see, because many of them will in fact become law in the next decade or two. So that's just something to think about. The fact that, when we consider and analyze whether or not these people, had a hope of succeeding, we need to sort of balance that against the fact that they really did think they could. And in fact, though 1890 and the Gilded Age seemed hopeless for them, within about a short period of, let's say, 15 years after the turn of the century, most of the things that they want, well, not most, a good portion of the things that they want will become law. What's more interesting, and we'll have to consider in later lessons, is what becomes law and why. Why do some people's desires get ignored while others are championed? But that's a question for another lesson when we start to look more particularly at the aims of the progressive movement. That's all for now. Like I said, it was a short lesson. How about me? Anyway.